My name's Jackson, the advocacy director at NYCJ. Um, yeah, and Phoebe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Phoebe. I am the Community Engagement Director at NYCJ, and we are tag teaming the presentation today.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen for the presentation. Um, this month's teach-in is about queer Earth, so exploring the intersections of queer and climate justice. Um, I just had to send a request to share my screen. Um, okay, that should work now. Sweet, thank you. Cool. Can everyone see that okay? Awesome. Cool. And yeah, thanks again for joining. We were excited to do a kind of pride themed teach-in this month. Um, so just a little background on me and Youth for Climate Justice. We're a youth-led organization from across the state advocating for climate justice and a livable future for young people. We were founded in 2019 to kind of challenge the status quo and bring our own voices to the table. And we're open to anyone under 30, and we also connect youth with the state legislature in Augusta through educational programming, as well as more grassroots events, such as the annual Youth Day of Action, which we have in April. So I wanted to begin by touching on what queer and climate justice is. So we pulled together a couple of pretty broad definitions, but definitions that I think are encompassing of what these two terms mean. So queer justice can often be defined as kind of like a segment of social justice, and it seeks to recognize how queer people, including those who are affected by certain socioeconomic factors like their immigration status, their race, sexuality, disability, how they are affected and experience systemic oppression. And that kind of ties into our definition of climate justice, which we believe requires the acknowledgement that the climate crisis that we are in was caused by failures of our, current systems, our capitalist, our colonialist systems that have existed. And it demands solutions that are intersectional. So working with people of different ages, working with different organizations and groups to hold those responsible for the crisis accountable and making sure that we can have a future where we can all thrive. So the big connection here is intersectionality. We know that queer individuals are often more vulnerable to impacts of climate change, and part of that can certainly depend on geography and demography, where they are located, if they're in communities of color, if they're in coastal towns and cities that are more prone to flooding, et cetera. Um, Another connection is kind of both of our movements have very shared causes of oppression, which, as I mentioned, were the capitalist and colonialist structures. Um, and then another thing we'll touch on today, and I think is really important and highlighting, is that the queer movement has been a really important force in the climate movement, but it hasn't always been reciprocal. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, and yeah, to touch briefly more on some more information on how climate change impacts the queer community. There are approximately 1.6 to 2 million um, estimated youth who are unhoused. Um, and about 20 to 40% of them identify as LGBTQIA plus. That makes it dangerous for people in those communities to move if they're even able to do so, or migrate in the event that climate catastrophes happen. Um, and some pretty recent data from the Listen Project, which I think a number of people on this call are familiar with. Um, that data found that 49% of respondents who are climate organizers in Maine self-identified as queer, which is a really, really big number. And that is kind of similar to some other statistics nationally. This is a really good example of kind of how queer and climate and indigenous cultures are connected, and it's two-spirit indigenous history. So um, that term is kind of like an umbrella term that reflects understandings of gender roles and spirituality and sexual and gender diversity in indigenous cultures. So there's long standing that shows that people who've identified as two-spirit have not adhered to the typical male, female, binary um, structure that we are trying to like dismantle in today's society. And a prominent two-spirit activist is Geo Neptune. They're from the Passamaquoddy Nation, um, and their photos on the right. Now I'll pass it to Phoebe.
Yeah. So queer ecology is a theory that challenges the idea that nature is static, um, pure or inherently normal. Just like queerness pushes back against rigid norms in gender and sexuality, queer ecology questions the assumptions that we make about what's natural in the environment. By intersecting queer theory and environmentalism, queer ecology reimagines the relationship between humans and nature, not as a hierarchy, but as a web of diverse, fluid connections. Queer and trans communities have long used geography and space to carve out safety, joy, and resistance, ranging from chosen family homes to queer eco villages and urban gardens. And these are not just safe spaces, but acts of environmental and spatial reimagining. So, in the next few slides, we're going to go over some other examples of queer ecology. So, same-sex behavior isn't rare in the animal kingdom at all. Scientists have documented it in over 1,500 species across the globe, and that it includes in giraffes, dolphins, geckos, chickens, cows, salmon, butterfly, pandas, and that's just a few. Um, One of the examples is Jonathan, the world's oldest living land mammal. He is a 193-year-old tortoise, and he's been partnered with another male tortoise, Fred, for over 30 years. So that's pretty sweet. Um, yeah, and queer ecology helps us recognize that queerness exists beyond human identities. It exists in nature, in ecosystems, in the way that life expresses itself. And it reminds us that the binary isn't a rule in biology, it's human invention.
Yeah, and what Phoebe's talking about also applies to other organisms and plants. I think it's important to note that the kind of male-female binary is something that was constructed. It's a social construct and it's been used as something for us to define people. But um, in reality, for example, that's not how like things exist amongst plants. Plants exist kind of outside of this binary that we've created, but sometimes we still impose like a male or a female binary onto them. Um, and some statistics suggest that about like 85% of the 250,000 flowering plant species have flowers that don't fit this human constructed binary. So one cool example of this is the Matilhia poppies, and they can reproduce asexually by cloning, as well as bisexually, having both male or female parts within each flower.
And so we wanted to highlight this example of queer ecology um, in art. The Queer Ecology Hanky Project is this traveling exhibition that weaves together queer identity, environmentalism, and creative resistance. It was organized by the artists Vanessa Adams and Mary Tremont. The project features 96 unique bandanas created by artists from across North America. And each one is in a different style and is a personal and political response to queer ecology. These handkerchiefs reimagine the historic hanky code once used to signal identity and desire, and transforms it into a visual language of queer environmental connection. Um, yeah, these projects tell stories of care and land and resistance and showcase how expansive and intersectional queer ecological thinking can be.
Yeah, and kind of moving back to the queer and environmental movements and how they intersect. I mentioned a little while ago that um, queer justice has had a pretty profound impact on climate justice, or just in the broader environmental or conservation movement. There are a lot of queer leaders in the environmental movement, a lot of specific queer outdoor organizations, some of which are here in Maine, and we'll talk about that in a couple other slides in a moment. Um, and the statistic I mentioned earlier about 49% of respondents to a survey in Maine identifying as queer and being part of the environmental movement in Maine, that kind of mirrors what the national landscape is like. Um, Queer people are twice as likely, at least, to join environmental movements than folks who are not um, queer. And so I think what we want to highlight is that these movements are connected and should always be connected with one another. Um, and we'll now talk about some queer environmental groups in Maine.
Yeah, so these are three groups that are doing some cool work with um, getting queer people outside and in the environment. There's Queerly Me, which hosts a lot of outdoor access events for people who identify as LGBTQIA. The Kindling Collective does similar sort of trips, bringing various, like bringing queer people outside, meeting people where they're at their various levels of outdoor experience and comfort. And they also have a gear library that aims to create an accessible way for people to get outside. And there's the Venture Out project, which leads a lot of backpacking and wilderness trips for the queer community. So we're lucky in this state to have these three organizations that are doing really cool work to help queer people gain access to nature.
Yeah, and there are a couple of others we wanted to highlight too. One is Dandy Ram Farm. They're based in Monroe, Maine. They've been involved in kind of the food sovereignty movement here in Maine, but they have like LGBTQ farm worker training events, trying to connect people who are living in rural areas and are queer, helping connect them with one another. And then there is this is through Pilgrim Lodge, the main conference, UCC. It's called Justice Together. And there, campers can explore the idea of justice through imagination, kinship, eco grief, and common good. Um, and they'll be talking about some interconnected issues that impact their communities. Um, so I think the message we wanted to convey today is that that queer people are here, we're everywhere, and our struggles are connected to various movements, including the climate movement. And it's really important that um, we show up for others, but also recognize when others aren't showing up for us and having some accountability to that degree. And we also wanted to pose kind of a couple of questions to everyone, maybe kind of kickstarting a conversation, but a few things we came up with include like how are you building community? Is community difficult to find where you currently live? And how can Maine environmental groups be better allies to the queer justice scene here in the state of Maine? Um, so if anyone has any questions in general, feel free to jump in, or if you kind of have a response to either of these three questions and want to kick us off, that'd be great too.